You wake before dawn on the St. Croix River in the spring of 1886, standing on a carpet of rolling timber that stretches a quarter-mile downstream. In your hands is a pike pole, 10 feet of ash wood tipped with steel, heavier than it looks, slick with river spray. Around you, 50 men balance on logs, moving at different speeds, shouting warnings you can barely hear over the roar of white water smashing against pine. The air smells like sap and cold mud. Your boots are soaked through. They've been soaked for 3 weeks. One newspaper called it white gold flooding south. 150 million board feet of timber riding the current toward the sawmills of Stillwater. But standing here, riding logs that weigh a ton each, you're thinking about something simpler. Don't slip, because if you do, the gap between 2 rolling logs closes in less than a second. Downstream, a boot floats past, empty. By the winter of 1880, the forests of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota had become the backbone of a booming nation. The Chippewa and St. Croix river systems, a maze of tributaries snaking through ice-locked wilderness, fed timber to the Mississippi and down to the growing cities of the Midwest. 15 million logs per season. Some drives stretched over 200 miles, from the headwaters where the trees fell to the sorting booms, where they would be claimed by Company Mark, Weyerhaeuser, Laird Norton, the Mississippi River Logging Company. These were not just businesses, they were empires built on white pine. You arrived at camp in November when the ground was frozen hard enough to haul. The bunkhouse was a low-slung shed with bunks stacked 3 high, a wood stove in the center that never quite drove out the cold, and the smell of wet wool that soaked into everything. 40 men slept shoulder to shoulder. You learned fast: eat heavy, sleep light, and don't ask questions. The average logger made $26 a month. 8 of that went back to the company store for boots, tobacco, and beans. The rest you saved if you lasted. They didn't call it logging. They called it putting in your time. The river towns, Stillwater, Winona, and Reed's Landing, lived and died by the drives. When the logs came through, the saloons filled, the brothels worked overtime, and the company store did enough business to justify another expansion. When the river froze, the towns went quiet. You could walk the streets of Stillwater in January and see more boarded windows than open ones. The men came from everywhere. Scandinavian immigrants who had heard there was work in the pineries. French-Canadian river pigs who had grown up on the Ottawa and knew how to ride timber. Drifters, drunks, and men running from something they would not talk about. If you could swing an axe or balance on a log, you had a job. If you could not, you starved or moved on. The system was simple. The company owned the land, the camps, the stores, and the towns. You worked for scrip, paper money good only at the company store, where a pair of boots cost 2 weeks' wages and a tin of tobacco cost a day's pay. Debt kept you there. Distance kept you there. There was no other work for 100 miles in any direction. You slept into paper shacks with shared beds, fought off lice, and tried not to catch pneumonia. An 1884 state report called the conditions unfit for human habitation. The companies kept building camps anyway. You spent your evenings in the bunkhouse, mending torn shirts with thread you bought on credit, counting the days until payout, and listening to men cough themselves to sleep. By early spring, the ice began to break. That's when the architecture of the work revealed itself. All winter, logging crews had been cutting upstream, felling white pine and stacking the logs on rollways, massive ramps built along the riverbanks. Millions of board feet, waiting. When the river opened, the rollways would be released, and the logs would ride the current south. The job had roles. River pigs walked the logs, keeping them moving, breaking up small jams before they turned into big ones. Jam breakers went into the worst tangles with peavies and cant hooks, prying apart tons of timber locked together by pressure and current. Boom men worked the sorting facilities downstream, guiding logs into company pockets using long poles and steam-powered winches. Dynamite crews, the powder monkeys, carried explosives in oilskin bags, wading into jams that wouldn't break any other way. The tools were simple: a pike pole for balance, a peavy for leverage, a cant hook for rolling, and dynamite when nothing else worked. You learned to read the current. You learned to feel a log shift under your feet a half second before it rolled. You learned that white pine floats high and moves fast, and that a 2-ton log doesn't care if you're in the way. Records from the era don't say how many men drilled these skills into muscle memory. They only say how many didn't. By the time the river opened, you either knew how to stay alive or you didn't. 1886, the Upper St. Croix, near the Minnesota-Wisconsin line. The rollways released just after dawn, and it was controlled chaos. Thousands of logs hit the water at once, surging downstream in a flood of timber and white spray. The noise was unbelievable. Wood cracking against wood, water roaring, men shouting warnings that got lost in the din. You could feel it in your chest. The first deaths happened in the first week. Men crushed during the release, pinned between logs and the riverbank. Men swept under by the surge and never seen again. Company records noted it with the kind of brevity that comes from seeing it before. 3 men lost in the first week. Standard. The work rhythm was dawn to dark, following the drive downstream. The camp moved with you. Wanigans, floating cookhouses, drifted along with the logs, serving beans and salt pork and coffee so strong it could strip paint. Supply rafts carried bedrolls, spare tools, and barrels of lamp oil. You slept in shifts, 4 hours if you were lucky, on wet ground or damp canvas. There was no dry place. Your first day on the logs, you learned what the river pigs already knew. Every step is a guess. The log under your feet might be stable, or it might roll without warning. You keep your knees bent, your weight centered, and your pike pole ready. You listen for the crack of timber shifting. You watch the men upstream, and you pray the log you're standing on doesn't decide to spin. The cold never left. The roar of water and the crack of colliding timber became the only sounds you heard, even in your sleep. 60 miles downstream, mid-river, the work found its rhythm. Walking logs was a skill that looked impossible until you'd done it 1,000 times. You used the pike pole for balance, planting the steel tip into the log ahead of you, shifting your weight as the current changed speed. The river moved fast here, 8 to 10 miles per hour in the main channel, and the logs moved with it, some faster than others, creating gaps and collisions that you had to read and react to in real time. The Widowmaker moment came without warning. A log rolled. Your leg got trapped between 2 pieces of moving timber. If you were lucky, someone upstream saw it and shouted. If you weren't, the gap closed and you went under. Drowning was fast. Crushing was faster. The pace demanded everything. Keep the logs moving. Break small jams immediately before they grew into big ones. Sleep deprivation became part of the job. 4-hour shifts, no dry place to rest. You worked, you ate, you slept, you worked again. One night, in the fog, you pulled a midnight shift and nearly hit a submerged snag, a deadfall tree lurking just under the surface, invisible until you were on top of it. The man next to you saw it a second before you did and yanked you back. He didn't say anything. Neither did you. There was nothing to say. Broken limbs were common. Drowning was part of the business. In a bad season, 1 man per week. Records don't say if that number included the ones who were never found. You learned not to think about it. You learned to move fast, stay light, and trust that the man upstream was watching your back. Most of the time, he was. May 1886. Devil's Elbow, a sharp bend in the St. Croix where the current slammed into a granite outcrop and the river turned almost 90 degrees. This was where jams formed. The physics were simple. Pressure builds, the center locks, the edges pile up. Logs stack on logs, layer after layer, until you've got a mountain of timber blocking the river and backing up the drive for miles. Finding the key log was part science, part prayer. It was the one piece holding everything else in place. Pull it, and the whole jam might break clean. Miss it, and nothing happens. Or worse, the jam shifts and crushes whoever's standing on it. The dynamite crews went in when nothing else worked. Powder monkeys waded into the jam with oilskin bags, set charges in the gaps between logs, lit the fuses, and ran. The silence before the crack was the worst part. Then the roar when it gave, timber exploding outward, the river surging through, and men sprinting for solid ground. You stood on an unstable jam once, water rising, the foreman pointing at what he thought was the key log. You could feel the whole mass shifting under your boots. The other men were watching. You set your peavey, pulled, and held your breath. It broke. In 1884, a jam at Taylor's Falls killed 4 men when it gave all at once. 2 of them were found miles downstream, wedged between logs. The other 2 were never recovered. Accidents like that made the newspapers. Most didn't. Most were just noted in the company ledger. Operational loss. The jam at Devil's Elbow broke clean this time. But you'd be back here next week, and the week after that, and every time the river bent and the logs piled up. By late May, the drive reached Stillwater, the largest log sorting facility in the world. The boom stretched across the river, a floating corral made of chained logs, holding back 200 million board feet of timber. Your job as a sorter was to read the bark stamps, company marks branded into the end of each log, and direct them into the right pockets using a pike pole and a lot of patience. 12-hour shifts. Your back screamed. One mistake cost the company hundreds of dollars. They made sure you knew it. The hidden danger was the sleepers, submerged logs that floated just under the surface, invisible until they rose and struck. Men got hit in the chest, the head, the legs. Some went into the water and didn't come back up. The boom machinery added another layer of risk. Steam-powered winches hauled cables under tension across the sorting pockets. When a cable snapped, it whipped back with enough force to cut a man in half. You worked through the day, reading stamps, sorting timber, keeping an eye on the sleepers. At night, you walked into Stillwater, payday town. The saloons were full. The fights were frequent. You paid off your debt at the company store, bought a new pair of socks, and tried to save the rest. Most men didn't. By morning, the money was gone, spent on whiskey, or cards, or women, or all 3. The next day, you were back on the boom, reading stamps, watching for sleepers, and counting the hours until the drive was done. They didn't tell you how many men died at the Stillwater boom that season. They didn't have to. You saw it yourself. Mid-season, you learned the lie of experience. Veterans died as often as greenhorns. Skill didn't make you safe. It just made you confident. And confidence killed as surely as ignorance. Hypothermia was the silent killer. Cold water, no dry clothes, slow decline. You fell in once, twice, 10 times. Each time you climbed back out, kept working, and told yourself you were fine. But the cold stayed inside you. By the end of the season, men were moving slower, thinking slower, dying from exposure without ever realizing how far gone they were. Infection killed just as many. A pike pole puncture in your hand, small wound, easy to ignore. You kept working. By the end of the week, the wound was festering. By the end of the month, blood poisoning set in. Camp doctor reports, when they existed, noted it plainly. Sepsis common, treatment rare. You carried a small wound on your hand for 2 weeks before it started to turn. By then, it was too late for anything but prayer. The question wasn't if you'd get hurt. The question was how many times you could fall in before your body gave up. How many cuts you could ignore before one of them killed you. How many close calls you could survive before your luck ran out. The answer was different for everyone. Some men lasted a season, some lasted 10. But the river didn't care about your experience, your skill, or how careful you were. It only cared about the gap between you and the next log, and how fast that gap could close. June 1886. Record heat, low water. The logs stranded on sandbars, and the only way to move them was manually. Crews working waist deep in the river, pushing timber with their shoulders and pike poles, trying to float them free. The work was brutal. The heat made it worse. Exhaustion compounds risk, slower reflexes, poor decisions. Men too tired to see the danger until it was too late. But the downstream mills demanded timber, and the foremen pushed harder. Speed over safety. Profit over lives. At Osceola, a jam broke on June 14. 6 men killed, 2 never recovered. A survivor later said, "We heard the crack, we ran, not everyone made it." You knew the man next to you. You knew his name, where he was from, that his family waited for him in Stillwater. When the jam broke, he was still standing on it. You weren't. In the company books, it was noted as an operational delay. The logs were moving again within 2 days. The bodies were buried, the ones they found, in unmarked plots outside town. Replacement crews arrived within the week. The emotional stakes weren't abstract. These were men you worked with, ate with, slept next to in the bunkhouse. Their deaths weren't statistics. They were faces, voices, stories cut short by timber and water, and a system that valued speed over everything else. You kept working. What else could you do? The river didn't stop. The drive didn't stop. And if you walked away, there was no other work, no other pay, no way to feed yourself or your family. The logs kept moving. The profit kept rising. After Osceola, the company response was swift and predictable. No compensation. The families received nothing. The legal doctrine was simple: assumed risk. You knew the job was dangerous when you took it. If you died, that was on you. Company scrip made it worse. Families were still paying off debts for food, for rent, for the coffin. One widow walked into the company store to buy a coffin for her husband and walked out owing more than she had when he was alive. Replacement workers arrived within days. No questions asked. If you could stand, you could work. The isolation was a weapon. No unions, no inspectors, no journalists. The camps were 100 miles from anywhere, accessible only by river or logging road. And the companies controlled both. You went to the funeral in Stillwater. The preacher said something about sacrifice and the dignity of labor. The widow stood silent, holding a child who didn't understand why his father wasn't coming home. After the service, she went to the company store. She bought the coffin on credit. The logs kept moving. The season continued. By the end of June, the drive was nearly complete, and the death toll was climbing toward 24. Official count. The real number was higher. Transients, immigrants. Men with no known family. They didn't always make it into the records. The system was built to run this way. Fast, cheap, and brutal. Men were replaceable. Timber was profit. And as long as the lumber mills downstream kept paying, the companies kept cutting, kept driving, and kept counting their losses in dollars instead of lives. End of season. 1886. The official records listed 23 men dead. That was almost certainly an uncount. Transients, immigrants, men with no known family. If they drowned and weren't found, they didn't make the books. The company buried the ones they recovered in unmarked plots outside Stillwater, donated $10 per burial, and moved on. The success metric was simple: 150 million board feet delivered. The mills were happy. The profit margins were strong. The next season's contracts were already signed. If you survived, you were lucky. If you didn't, you were forgotten. Your name might make it into a company ledger, might get mentioned at a church service, might be carved into a wooden cross that would rot away in 5 years. Or it might not. Most men left no trace at all. The St. Croix drives weren't unique. The same work, the same risks, the same death tolls played out on rivers across the upper Midwest, the Chippewa, the Wisconsin, the Menominee, the Au Sable. Tens of thousands of men, over 40 years, moving billions of board feet of timber from forest to mill. How many died? Records don't say. Estimates range from hundreds to thousands. But the truth is, no one counted carefully enough to know. What we do know is this: the timber built cities. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago. The homes, the factories, the rail ties, the bridges, all of it started as trees in the Wisconsin and Minnesota forests, cut by men with axes and saws, floated down rivers by men with pike poles and peavies, sorted and sold by companies that valued profit over everything else. By the 1890s, things began to change. Steam-powered log transport, rail lines replacing some of the river drives, boom improvements, safety inspections, sporadic, inconsistent, but present. The Wisconsin Labor Commission issued a report in 1895, noting that conditions have improved, but lives cannot be returned. The last major log drive on the St. Croix ran in 1915. By then, the great forests were mostly gone, cut down and shipped south. The river went quiet. The boomtowns adapted or died. Stillwater survived by reinventing itself. The others, Reed's Landing, Beef Slough, Winona's logging district, faded into memory. The legacy was written in blood, timber, and the infrastructure of a growing nation. The men who died building it were rarely named, almost never compensated, and quickly forgotten. The companies that profited moved on to new forests, new rivers, new crews. The cycle repeated itself in the Pacific Northwest, in the Rockies, wherever there were trees to cut and rivers to float them down. But the cost was already paid. Thousands of men, immigrants, drifters, young men chasing work, old men with nowhere else to go, had drowned, been crushed, succumbed to infection, or exposure or exhaustion. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves or lost to the river. Their families were left with debt and grief, and the nation built itself on their backs. Today, if you walk through the Stillwater Historic District, you can still see remnants of the boom. At low water, old boom chains are visible, rusted and half buried in the riverbed. The buildings that once housed company offices are now antique shops and cafes. Tourists come for the charm, unaware of the blood that built it. Minneapolis and St. Paul owe their existence, in part, to the timber that came down the St. Croix. Every Victorian home, every old factory, every wooden beam in every historic building. Someone risked their life to move it. Someone stood on rolling logs in freezing water, balanced on unstable jams, worked 14-hour shifts for $26 a month, and gambled that today wouldn't be the day the river took them. The pike pole from the 1886 season sits in a museum now, behind glass. It weighs 10 pounds. It's worn smooth where hands gripped it, day after day, season after season. It's the kind of tool that feels ordinary until you imagine using it to stay alive. When you see a wooden beam in an old house or a weathered boardwalk along a waterfront, remember where it came from. Remember the men who brought it out of the forest, who rode it down the river, who knew that every step on those rolling logs could be their last. The trees are gone, but their legacy remains, built on blood, sweat, and the kind of courage that comes from having no other choice. What do you think? Was the cost worth it, or could we have done better? Share your thoughts below.